Good afternoon. I'm Melanie White, president of the Women's Club. Welcome to members in the auditorium, and welcome to our members viewing online. We're so glad that you're here with us today. Thank you. Following today's program, please join us in the Halsey Hall to meet Geraldine Brooks. Now, I want to tell you that when our program concludes today, please allow her to get right to the book signing in our reception room. You may visit with her there. She will need to leave the reception right at 3:45. So please let her get to the reception room. You get yourselves there, get in line so everybody can meet her, and things will go smoothly. Thank you. There are so many wonderful opportunities to connect with the Women's Club. Each Wednesday through November 26th from 10 a.m. to noon, the Women's Club Library is open to members on the second floor of the Bowling Haxel House. Please stop by to say hi and check out a book or two. Our catalog is available via the library tab on the members area of our website. The gala, Hard Hats and High Heels, to benefit the Bowling Haxel House Foundation, takes place this Thursday, October 30th. This is our last membership event in the house until next season. Registration for the gala is enclosed. Today, Monday, October 27th, is the close of the silent auction at 4:30 p.m. The live auction items will be presented for continued bidding at the event on Thursday night. In addition to the auction, we're having a 50-50 raffle. I love these. Purchase a raffle ticket for $20 at the gala table, and you will be entered into a cash drawing, splitting the winnings 50-50. You win and the house wins, even split. You need not be present to win. The drawing will take place at the close of the gala. Please contact the development office for questions about the auction, raffle, or gala. Make Your Own Holiday Wreath is on November 15th from 3 to 5 in the afternoon. The registration deadline is November 8th. Our holiday reception, can you believe we're thinking about this, is December 8th from 1 to 3 p.m. It will be right here in the Halsey Hall. The deadline is December 1st. We have a private tour of the Virginia Holocaust Museum on January 15th from 10:30 in the morning to 12:30. Registration deadline for this is January 8th. You may sign up on the Women's Club website. I have some very, very good news. Sometimes you try and do things and you think it's going to take a while, and sometimes a new member who has stood up and said, I will arrange for the Westminster Canterbury bus to start next week. And I thought this was going to take a long time. So if you live at the Westminster Canterbury and you would like to take the bus, it will be leaving at 1:25 in front of the center. Tony Decorata is going to send out an email instruction, and she also will put information in the tails. This will be every Monday, and she also is going to give arrange for a ride to our holiday reception, but we're still working on the time for the pickup. More on that later. Thank you so very, very much for picking that up, Tony. Please silence your cell phones. Yes, thank you. And she's a new member. Silence your cell phones. Thank you to the Library Committee for providing our refreshments today. Thank you to Sabette Stroman for serving as chair of the day. Sabette will now introduce Geraldine Brooks.
Good afternoon. It is my honor this afternoon to introduce Geraldine Brooks. She is a master storyteller known for her immersive, character-driven novels, and she has proven herself skilled at both fiction and nonfiction. Her range is amazing. She's written historical novels about plagues and Puritans, about the writing of the Bible, and about the greatest racehorse in American history. Her books, March, Year of Wonders, People of the Book, Caleb's Crossing, The Secret Chord, and Horse, have been translated into more than 30 languages and have sold millions of copies around the world. Her most recent book, Memorial Days, is a deeply personal memoir about personal loss and the shock of the unexpected when her husband, the author Tony Horwitz, collapsed and died on a DC sidewalk. It's a book Geraldine says she wrote for herself to come to terms with her grief, but it is also a tribute to a larger-than-life man and the amazing life they shared. There are too many awards and prizes to list here, but her fiction debut, Year of Wonders, a novel of the plague, was named a notable book of the year in 2001, and her retelling of Little Women, March, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 2006. Just last month, she was also awarded the 2025 Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, which honors her entire body of work, recognizing her originality and her strong, unique voice. This afternoon, Geraldine joins us to discuss the art of the historical novel, making fiction from fact. Her early career as a nonfiction writer and journalist contributed to her expertise on this topic as she honed her eye for detail and perfected her research skills. An Australian native, she began her career as a reporter at the Sydney Morning Herald before moving to the United States to earn her master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. For over a decade, she served as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, covering conflicts in the Middle East, in Africa, and the Balkans. This experience resulted in her nonfiction works, 9 Parts of Desire, Foreign Correspondence, and The Idea of Home. In 1990, she and her husband won the Overseas Press Club Award for Best Coverage of the Gulf War and a Citation for Excellence in 1991 for their series, War and Peace. She continues to work in the nonfiction space with her 2025 contribution of an essay to Michael Lewis's book, Who is Government? The Untold Story of Public Service. We also found out at lunch that she was collaborating with Kamala Harris on her new book. One of Geraldine's many gifts to us as a writer is her ability to eliminate the past, telling stories that are otherwise lost to us. Please join me in welcoming this archaeologist of histories and voices, Geraldine Brooks.
Well, wasn't that the best introduction ever? It's wonderful to be back here in Virginia, which was our home for 10 years, and we loved it very much. I want to take you back with me to when I was a little girl growing up in Sydney, Australia. I was very perplexed by the sign on the beach path near where my parents lived that said, "Watch for falling rocks." I didn't understand why they picked the verb watch. It seemed very unhelpful to me. I thought the sign should have read, "Run from falling rocks." So ever since then, I've collected signage that seems to me to be particularly unhelpful. And Australians are really good at this. If you're driving in the outback, they have a lot of signs that say, "Drive according to prevailing conditions." This is not instructive. Or they have a sign that says, "Accidents can lead to injury and death." Yeah? You really needed to spend the money to make a sign to tell us that? Sometimes the sign will have a really useful message, like the one over the highway in Florida that said, "Texting while driving kills." And I thought, great message. But then I noticed flashing underneath, it said, "For more safety tips, text, hashtag." And then there's the one that I see very often on the freight boat coming and going from my home on Martha's Vineyard, which is, "For your safety, please exit the freight deck while the vessel is underway." And every time I see that sign, and I see it a lot, I just imagine all the cars with their bungee-corded extrusions of bicycles and extra mattresses and pillows obediently driving off into Vineyard Sound. And then the other day I was in a ladies' room in the stall, and it said, "You are not alone." If there's one place. So why do I fixate on these signs so much? I think it's because it reminds me what a precious gift our English language is and how easy it is to blow it. That people went to a lot of trouble thinking up those signs and the important messages they carried, and yet they got it so absolutely wrong. And as Mark Twain said, the difference between the right word and the wrong word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. So for me, as a novelist, I am always in search of just exactly the right word. And I've been thinking about this ever since years ago. I was talking to the wonderful English novelist Jim Crace, and he had just written a novel called Quarantine, which is set in biblical Israel. And to research the novel, he had gone camping in the Judean desert with a Bedouin guide. And the first night of that trip, the guide, Ahmed, woke him up with a lovely cardamom-scented cup of Arabic coffee, and he said, "Mr. Jim, how did you sleep?" And Jim Crace replied, "Ahmed, I slept like a log. How did you sleep?" Because Jim had raised his eyes to the bare rock-ribbed hillsides of the Judean desert, and there weren't any logs. So he said, "Ahmed, how did you sleep?" And Ahmed said, "Mr. Jim, I slept like a dead donkey." And that's the essential job of the novelist, is to go through your work and find the logs and turn them into dead donkeys. And luckily, I have a great resource when doing this, which is the wonderful Oxford Historical Thesaurus of the English language. So if you need to know what word a person of the period you're writing about would have used, you can find the word in current usage and dig down all the way to early Icelandic and see where the usage was. And this was a good example of using this tool was when I was writing Caleb's Crossing. And I needed my young female narrator who was learning midwifery. I needed her to talk about a fetus. But I'm pretty sure that in Massachusetts in 1665, she was not running around talking about a fetus. So I went to the Historical Thesaurus and I went down fetus to mid-17th century, and I found that the word she would have used is shapeling. And I think when you get it right, it's a kind of time traveling, because you're suddenly in a different mentality and you're giving respect to the character and respect to your reader. I don't always get it right. In my first novel, Year of Wonders, I have my young narrator speaking about the mauve tide of the heather in the Peak District. Big problem. The word mauve did not come into use in English until 1796. So in 1665, she was not reflecting on the mauve tide of the heather. So why is it important? I think it's important because it's respectful to you, the reader, to do the work, because I am trying to convince you that I'm telling you the truth of how it might have been in the past. And if I get it wrong, and you know that she didn't use the word mauve, suddenly I have undercut your belief in me. And if I do that, my edifice that I'm trying to create becomes less strong. So for me, the research is very important, to build a strong structure of fact, historical fact, and linguistic appropriateness, so that when I then have to go ahead and imagine the things on which the historical record is silent, things that we cannot find out no matter how much research we do, I can make something imaginatively strong because it is sitting on that foundation of carefully sourced fact. So that's how I try and do all my novels. But I've come to this gradually because I didn't set out to be a novelist at all. As you heard in the lovely introduction, I started out as a journalist, and I wanted to be a journalist from the time I was 8 years old. And I remember the moment when I conceived this ambition extremely vividly. It was the first time my mother had taken me into the city to see where my dad worked. And at that time, he was working as a proofreader for the Sydney newspaper. And we arrived at his office in the afternoon, right before the afternoon edition of the paper was about to go to press. And so he took me down, hand in hand, to the press floor. And it was quite overwhelming. We went past all these gigantic linotype machines with their clattery, spidery arms, grabbing the metal type in those days that they used. And we get down to the press floor, and the air is misty with ink. And there are these gigantic rolls of newsprint ready to go. And then the foreman hits the button, and the presses roll, and the entire building vibrates. And I can feel it coming right up my body, and the newsprint speeds in a blur across the room, and the papers start landing on the conveyor belt, and my dad reaches out and grabs one and hands it to me. And it's warm. It's hot off the press. And I remember looking down at that inky black headline and thinking, you are the first person that knows what's going on in your city right now. And I loved that idea, and I wanted to be the person who wrote that story that said exactly what was going on. And so when it came time to go to college, I thought, I read the paper, and I thought, what does a journalist need to know? What would make me a good hire? And I saw that the newspaper was full of a lot of politics, but also a lot of cultural coverage. So I looked in the university handbook and prospectus and decided I would do a double major in government and fine arts. And 4 years later, I graduated, and I was really well informed in things like the uses of tempera and Quattrocento Italian wall painting, and the importance of the subconscious in Kandinsky and Clay, and classical political theory from Plato to Hobbes, and bicameral parliaments and the American Electoral College even. And it worked. The Sydney Morning Herald hired me. And they sent me to the sports department. And I got to admit it, I hated that job. I wasn't writing anything. I was the assistant to the racing writers, which meant I had to go with them to every race meeting in Sydney and at speed take down details on every horse in every race. Details like what the odds were, what they went out to, what they started at, the condition of the track, the weights the horse was carrying, where it was at the turn, where it was at the finish, and fill out all these cards that the writers would then rely on for information. And there's a lot of races in Sydney, so this was fairly relentless, and it got more hectic as the week wore on. So Friday night there were the trots, and then you got up really early in the morning to go to the gallops, and after the gallops you went to that last redoubt of the hopeless gambler, the greyhounds. And then when the greyhound races were over, I had to go back to the Sydney Morning Herald building and go down to the press floor and check that the results in the first edition were accurate. And this was important because this was pre-internet and dinosaurs were still walking the earth, but illegal bookmakers paid out on the results reported in the first edition of the Sydney Morning Herald. So if I made a mistake, I would be terminated, and possibly not just by the Sydney Morning Herald. So it taught me to be very accurate, but I really did not like the job, not just because it was scary and tedious, but because if you go to that many race meetings, you see accidents and you see horses destroyed, and I love animals, and I could not stand it. It was just terrible. So the minute they let me out of the sports department and liberated me to the nirvana of the features department, I said to myself, I will never go to another race again as long as I live. Well, be very careful when you make those promises to yourself. So I love this quote that I found from Henry David Thoreau, and I love it because it is so inapplicable to my life. And this is what Thoreau wrote. The youth gets together his materials to build a bridge to the moon, or perchance a palace or a temple on the earth. And at length, the middle-aged man concludes to build a woodshed with them. So I think my life went the opposite way. I started out with the woodshed. I wanted to be a reporter in the town of my birth to do stories that would be useful and entertaining to people. And then suddenly my life took an unexpected swerve, and I got a scholarship to come to the United States to graduate school at the journalism program at Columbia University. And it was a wonderful opportunity to hone my craft and to have an adventure in one of the world's great cities. And I was so excited, and but I thought, oh yeah, no, I'll get this degree and then I'll go back to Sydney and get on with my real life. But I met two men that year, and one of them was Tony Horwitz. And Rita, I married him. The other one was the recruiter for the Wall Street Journal. And I had learned that the Wall Street Journal had an internship program for the summer. So I thought, great, I'll just do this summer internship after I get my degree, and then I'll go back to Sydney and get on with my real life. But when I turned up to be interviewed for the internship, they said, you're too old to be an intern. But we'd like to consider you for a full-time job. So why don't you come back to be interviewed for that? And I ran back to Columbia and talked to my journalism professor about what should I say? How should I present myself? And he said a lot of useful things, but he also said, they will ask you the Cleveland question. And they ask everybody, so don't worry about it. It's just a test to see how serious you are about working for the Wall Street Journal. So they'll say, would you be willing to relocate to Cleveland? And sure enough, they asked, and I answered, and they sent me there. And that was my first foreign assignment. It was actually a wonderful place to work. I had a brilliant young bureau chief, and I got to cover every kind of story you can think of from Cleveland, because I had a piece of plastic that the Wall Street Journal was paying for, and if I could think of a good enough idea for a story, they would send me to do it, and it was great. I loved it. But then, my dad was getting very ill, and I had to go back to Sydney, so I opened the first bureau for the Wall Street Journal that they'd ever had in the Australasian region, and it was a great job because they'd never had anyone there. They had no idea what to expect me to do. So I'd throw them a bone every now and then by interviewing the treasurer or doing a corporate profile, but most of the time I adventured around my own country doing crazy things like going on one of the last great cattle droves in Western Queensland, or delivering supplies by barge through the crocodile-infested waters of remote Aboriginal communities in the far north. And some of you might have seen a film called Crocodile Dundee. You probably thought it was a broad comedy. It was a documentary film. It was crazy up there. So I'd gone to New Zealand to write a story about how they were very advanced in global warming science around the greenhouse gas methane, just because they have so many sheep in New Zealand. They have about 1,000 sheep for every human being. And so sheep emit a lot of methane, then climate scientists study it. And so I had spent a week chasing climate scientists up verdant New England mountainsides while they got methane samples from sheep. I'll just let you imagine how that went. I wrote the story, and I was sitting with Tony at home in Sydney watching a movie, and the phone rang, and it was the Wall Street Journal foreign editor. And it was the first time she'd ever called me. I thought, this is not good. I am about to get the sack for putting too many farting sheep jokes in the Wall Street Journal. But she was actually calling to offer me the Middle East correspondence job. And the next thing I knew, I was in Cairo, and I was a war correspondent. And this is where, the building the temple bit started for me, because suddenly the job had a kind of great moral weight, because as a foreign correspondent in the troubled places of the world, you have a big responsibility to bear witness to the consequences of the foreign policies that are dreamed up in the White House or in Whitehall, and you see the effects of them in ordinary people's lives. And I probably I found that work incredibly, it was a privilege to do it, and I would have kept doing it probably. It would have been about 10 years, and I was following a lead about a massacre that had happened in Nigeria, where the rumor was that Shell Oil had got into cahoots with the brutal military dictatorship of Sani Abacha and had called the military to fire on unarmed farmers who were protesting Shell's 35-year despoliation of their land. And sitting in New York, I hadn't credited this because I thought no major oil company would do such a thing. And I got there and found out it was even worse than had been described, and I had gathered all the evidence of the brutality of what had occurred and the terrible condition of the population in this area where Shell had extracted billions in oil wells, but there was not one school, not one clinic, nothing for the people. And as you do as a journalist, I got that evidence together, and then I went to get the Nigerian military side of the story. And that didn't go well. In fact, they handed me over to the secret police and they threw me in the slammer. And I'm lying on this concrete floor and I don't know how long they're going to keep me there. And I start to think, goodness me, you are 39 years old and you have neglected to get pregnant. Because I didn't know, they could have kept me for a long time. And luckily they didn't. They threw me out. They deported me 3 days later. And I got home and I greeted Tony with great enthusiasm. Our son Nathaniel was born the following year. And at that point, I didn't want to go off on long open-ended assignments to dangerous places anymore because I had this wonderful infant. And that was when Tony said to me, you've always talked about that village we visited when we had a few days off and we went to England, to the Peak District. And I had been thinking about this. So we had gone on a hike in the Peak District, and we saw a sign. It was a finger post, and it said the name of this village, Eam. And underneath it said Plague Village. And I thought, well, not many places try and attract tourists by putting up signs saying Plague Village. But it worked for us. We went there. And in the parish church was a description of what had happened in 1665 when bubonic plague had come to the village. And the villagers had taken the unique decision to quarantine themselves rather than flee and spread the infection into surrounding communities. And we'd walked out of that church and down to where they had conducted church service during the plague, because they didn't have a germ theory of disease, but they knew that proximity was one way that people got sick. They didn't know the mechanism, but they knew that they needed to socially distance, so they closed the church, and they had their service socially distanced in a beautiful dell. And I remember walking under the dappled sunlight of those trees and imagining those people and what it must have been like, because during quarantine, 2/3 of the villagers died. So how did you come to terms with the fact that you had made this decision of self-sacrifice that was what God wanted of you, and yet it hadn't stopped the death? And how did that affect people? And did it bring them to their worst self or their best self, this experience of catastrophe? Because that was something I was seeing every day in my day job as a reporter of catastrophe, was that some people in that situation will become incredibly brave, incredibly kind, incredibly generous. Others will become morally lost and unbelievably cruel. And so thinking about that, I had, run the experiences that I was witnessing with that morally lost Baathist torturer, or that incredibly brave young Eritrean woman who stepped out of the role she'd expected when it was asked of her to do something different. And So Tony said, why don't you try and write that? And I didn't know if I could write fiction, so I wrote the 2 first chapters and the last chapter, and I sent it off to my nonfiction agent. And crickets, I didn't hear back from her. And I thought, oh, well, it was lousy, she hated it, I better think of something else to do. Maybe somebody will let me lie around a swimming pool with Brad Pitt and write a profile. But when you've been a war correspondent, nobody thinks of you for that. Anyway, about 5 weeks later, she calls me up and she said, I sold your book. And then I had to write it. And lucky for me, somebody wanted to read it, so I got to keep doing it. And moving right along, 4 novels later, I had to recant on my promise to myself that I would never attend another horse race, because I found myself writing a book about the most famous racehorse of the American 19th century. And I'll just tell you quickly how that came about. I was at a writer's retreat in Santa Fe, and as I've said, I love animals, and they had, this retreat was at a ranch, and there were beautiful Appaloosa and paint horses there, and I was dangling over the corrals admiring these horses, and one of the wranglers said, you really love the horses, you should come for a trail ride. I said, I can't ride. And he said, yes, you can. These horses know their job. They won't let you fall off. I believed him, and the next day I'm following behind him through the beautiful pink arroyos of New Mexico, and we're on the cliff edge, and he says, let's pick up a canter, and off we go. And it was fabulous. And I'm home about a week later, and a young friend comes over, and I'm regaling her with what an ecstatic experience this was. And she looks out the window and she says, you've got a few acres here, you could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse. A free horse. Where in Virginia, I am sure a few of you have had experience with horses, yes? Yeah, there's no such thing. And this horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. But I didn't care because she was beautiful. And I knew this because she was in an ad. And it was an ad for a fast-acting cream to treat vaginal yeast infections. Horse gallops across the Mexican altiplano, voiceover. Some things should be fast. So this horse arrives, and suddenly I am so not interested in writing about King David anymore, because there are no horses in Second Iron Age Israel. And I'm not getting any work done. I'm out learning, I'm at writing lessons, I'm on a trail ride, I'm with the farrier, the saddle fitter, the horse intuitive, the horse masseur, and yes, the orthopedist, because I did fall off and break something. And meanwhile, the cost of this free horse is going through the roof, and there's no income coming in. And then this magical moment happens. I'm invited to a donor's lunch at Plymouth Pawtuxet Museum, and they had been extremely helpful to me when I was writing Caleb's Crossing, so I was delighted to do them a favor and come and sit and tell their donors what a great resource the museum was. So I'm sitting there with the donor on either side, having a lovely conversation, when I start catching scraps of conversation from down the table where a gentleman from the Smithsonian is regaling his table mates with the story of how he has just delivered the skeleton of the most famous racehorse of the 19th century from a forgotten corner of a dusty attic, the Natural History Museum, to pride of place in an exhibit on the history of the thoroughbred in Kentucky, because this horse, more than any other, is responsible for Kentucky being the center of thoroughbred breeding. And he's saying how this horse was not only the fastest horse that had ever been clocked at the time, it was also the greatest stud sire in American racing history. And if any horse you've ever heard of in America is a descendant of this horse. And then he got up to what happened to the horse during the Civil War. And my salad is uneaten. And my donors no longer have a scintilla of my attention. because I'm just laser focused on this guy, and I know I've got the subject for my next book. And Tony was a great help to me with this book because he was the real historian in the family, and he loved this period of history. And any of you who've read his books like Confederates in the Attic or Spying on the South or Midnight Rising know that that period he was all over it. And so he would bring me these love gifts from the archives, wonderful information that I could use for the novel. And we even traveled together because our research for my novel and for his book Spying on the South overlapped in Kentucky, and some of the same characters were involved. So we had a wonderful research trip on it. And then he finished his book and he went off on book tour, and I am struggling because this book turned out to be much more complicated than I thought it was going to be. And so I'm at home typing away, and I get a call, and I know he's in Washington, and I see on the phone that the call's from George Washington Hospital. So I pick it up, and a very tired young resident tells me he collapsed in the street and died. And that was it. My life exploded, and I didn't know what to do with myself. It was Memorial Day weekend. I had to get off Martha's Vineyard, which is very hard to do on a public holiday, and had to get to Washington, and just one thing after another, and all the crazy bureaucracy that happens when somebody dies suddenly, where your credit cards all get canceled because he was the primary card holder. Your health insurance gets canceled, and they don't even tell you that this has happened, which could be catastrophic in this crazy health system that we have. Somebody at the local courthouse who's doing the probate on the will decides that I need to have a guardian ad litem appointed to look after the interests of my youngest son. My head exploded because they would never do that to a surviving father. And I said, I'm not accepting that. I'm going to court. I'm going to fight that. So all these things that I had to do when what I really needed to be doing was grieving Tony. And it took me 3 years until I realized that I had been living behind a big old mask, and that mask was a mask of a woman acting normal when I didn't feel normal at all. And I knew I would have to do something about it. And I thought, well, what do writers do? They write. And I can't write here because there's too much still coming at me from every direction. And my kids, one was in college and one was happily working away in Brooklyn. And I thought, I'm going to leave everything behind, and I'm going to go to the most remote place I can think of, and I'm going to do this work, this very delayed work of grieving for Tony. And that's what Memorial Days is all about. That was what I did to try and get back into some kind of alignment between acting normal and actually feeling normal. And so that was that book. And that brings us more or less up to date, although as was mentioned earlier, I have done a few things since that book came out. And one of them was Who is Government, which was a cry from the heart by a number of writers who picked somebody in the public service pretty much at random to just look at the great work that was being done on our behalf by these incredibly dedicated, brilliant people who could make tons more money in the private sector, but have a dedication to public service. And then to see what has happened to them subsequently has been heartbreaking. And speaking of heartbreaking, reliving the election with Kamala Harris for her book, 107 Days, also had heartbreaking moments, although I have to tell you, she is an extremely funny person, and we had a lot of laughs together in the compressed time frame when we were working on that book. And she would have been a very good president, and I think working with her just it just underlined the feeling that I already had that we made a tragic mistake. But anyway, Let's see, what else did I want to tell you? I guess I just wanted to end by talking a little bit about what it is to write about the past. And I think I'm going to read you something that to me sums it up more beautifully than any words I've found. And Tony was always trying to get the boys interested in history. And one of his most successful ploys was reading to them at night when they were little from a wonderful book written in 1936 called A Little History of the World. And this book was written for children by an Austrian author named Ernst Hans Gombrich. And it's a fantastic book, and both the boys loved it. It was a big success. But he describes the business of writing about the past, and to me, he sums it up perfectly. It is, he says, like lighting a scrap of paper and dropping it into a bottomless well. As it falls and burns, it lights up the sides of the well in the same way that our memories light up the past. The deeper it falls, the less is illuminated. Living memory gives way to archives, archives to cave paintings to fossils, until the light goes out and everything is dark. But, as Gombrich writes, even in that dark silence, we have not yet reached the beginning of the human story. Behind every beginning, no matter how long ago, there is another beginning. Every generation has its once upon a time. Your grandmother, her grandmother's grandmother, and already we're back several hundred years, and every one of them probably telling stories that started with some version of once upon a time. And I am privileged to be in that long line of storytellers, and I want to thank you as readers for giving me that privilege, and I intend to keep doing it as long as you keep reading. Thank you. And now the most fun part for me is questions from you. And do we have a microphone situation, or do people just... Oh, there is a microphone, and here is a hand. Hello. Can't see you over the podium.
I want to know how the book was finished over the horse race.
Oh,
You
my
had just
goodness.
started it, and then you
No,
had the problems.
I was halfway through it when Tony died, and I did not write a word of it for another year. Because to write fiction, you have to be really down a rabbit hole, you have to be undistracted. And I was not only broken and grieving, but I was unbelievably distracted by the fire hose of quotidian things that I had to master, because we'd been married for 35 years and he had handled a lot. You know, I handled half our life, he handled the other half, and never the twain met. And I had no idea how he did the things that he did. And what he did very well, luckily. And one of them was looking after our retirement savings. But I looked at, what he had in the portfolio, and I did not understand it. And I'm like, I wish I could ask him, why do we have puts on the Nikkei? And what's a put? And what's the Nikkei? So there was all that to be got through. And then finally, I did get back to my desk, and I think it was COVID that made it possible. I had the boys back home with me, and suddenly we didn't have to pretend to be normal because nothing was normal. And I didn't have to prepare a face for the faces that I met. I could just stay at home and be quiet. And somewhere in that quiet, I got the courage to crawl back to my desk. And I needed to finish the book because Tony had loved the idea of this book so much and helped me so much with it. And I felt that I had to finish it so I could dedicate it to him. And I did. And so I didn't realize, though, that And then my dear friend Michael Lewis read an early copy and said, you understand that there's two different books here. There's the before book and the after book. And I think a lot of what happens in the second half of A Horse is very much influenced by what was going on in my soul at that time. Anybody else? There's two down here, and there's somebody got the mic up the back.
So I have a very specific question. What can we expect from you next, writing-wise? What's your next story?
So I'm doing a couple more. I think it's very hard to not be involved in this moment that we're in, and I'm working as a contributor to a collection called Declaration, a Civic Gospel, which is a celebration of the Declaration of Independence for its 250th birthday next year. So I'm contributing to that. And then I'm also writing an essay for the 100th anniversary of the Smithsonian Magazine, if we still have a Smithsonian Magazine by the time it turns 100. It's about ideas that shaped America, and I'm writing about Harriet Beecher Stowe. And when I get done with those projects, I intend to return to what I thought I would be returning to back in March, when the opportunity to collaborate with Kamala Harris came up. I had been in Oxford researching my next novel, and I had the great pleasure of being a visiting researcher in New College at Oxford. And I love to say New College because it was new in the 14th century. So that's what's next. Two down here.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk from the transition of being a journalist and then a historic fiction writer and then a memoir, working with Senator Harris, if you could talk about how those were all different.
Yeah, so it was the hardest. Did you hear the question? It's about making the transition basically from journalism to fiction and to other genres. So my first book was 9 Parts of Desire, and that was an entirely journalist's book. It was to try and distill everything that I'd learned after a decade of living in the Middle East and covering the region actually mainly through the women's stories, because that was something that was available for me to do as a female correspondent that was not available to my male colleagues. Because in a lot of countries, women have no public role. And there's a big mistake that means they don't have a role. They don't have public power, but they have private power. And I learned that most glaringly in Iran, where Khomeini's wife was a power center that everybody in Iran knows about, but nobody outside. And if you ignore the role of the bedroom and the mosque, you will never understand Islamic society and how it works. So anyway, I wrote that book, and that was the hardest transition actually of all of them, because it was moving from the longest piece I had ever written was 3,000 words. And the easiest thing for a reader to do is stop reading, and it took me a solid 6 months to figure out how I was going to have a narrative thread through this longer piece of writing that would sustain the interest of the reader. And so that was the hardest. Then my second book was also nonfiction, but it was personal. It was a funny little hybrid book that was part travel adventure and part memoir. And it's called Foreign Correspondence, but it's about my obsession with pen pals when I was a kid growing up in Sydney. So it's about my life with my family in Sydney and the way I thought that I lived at the ends of the earth, and that every kid my age somewhere else was having a more exciting, more historically relevant experience. And so I had pen pals in all kinds of countries. And then when I became a real foreign correspondent, I had 2 pen pals in Israel. I had a Palestinian and an Israeli pen pal. And I didn't know where they were. I couldn't even remember their names at that point. But every time I looked at a young reservist soldier, I thought, well, that could be my pen pal. And every time I looked at a Palestinian, that could be my pen pal. And then I go home because my father is dying, and I go through his papers because I know I won't have the heart for it after he's died. And I find that among his papers, he's kept all my pen pals' letters. And so I had their addresses, from the 1970s and early 80s. But still, I had a piece of string that I could follow, and I decided that I would go and try and find them. So that's what I did. So writing that book was really instructive because that was such a strange little hybrid story, and it becomes a story about my relationship with my father as well as everything else, because it happens in the wake of his death. And that freed me up in a way so that when I sat down to make the transition to fiction, it wasn't as hard as if I had started cold, I think. And I think also because I look for things that actually happened, things that are implausible if you made them up, but because they actually happened are fascinating, like the voluntary quarantine, or like the fact that a Native American youth in 1665, raised in his own language and culture on the island of Martha's Vineyard, went on to master Latin and Greek by the time he was 14 and was the first Native American to graduate from Harvard in 1665. Now, if I had asserted that as a fiction, everybody would have said, get out of here. But it happened. He existed. And so it reminds me of another great saying of Mark Twain's, fiction must be plausible, truth needn't be. There was somebody else down the front with a question?
I'm not sure how to use this.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay. I read Horse a few years ago. It's my all-time favorite book.
Thank you.
And when I was reading it, I was wondering how you, the author, because it jumps different places, so you don't start writing page 1 and write it all the way through. So how do you do that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a risk, actually. And I had no idea when I got intrigued by this story of the racehorse that, A, I was going to end up writing a story about the history of racism in America, because I had no idea that the horse, the early success of the horse, was on the shoulders of the expertise of enslaved black horsemen. So there was that whole angle. And then once you write about racism in the antebellum period, if you have a contemporary thread, which I wanted to have because I wanted to talk about what happened to this horse's skeleton at the Smithsonian. I was very interested in the science of it. And the old journalist in me loves getting up in other people's business, so I wanted to go behind the scenes at the Smithsonian and see what people actually did with bones there. But once you bring it into the contemporary sphere, you cannot leave the story of racism behind in the 1850s as if that's something over and done with, and we don't have to bother our pretty heads with that anymore, because clearly it's not. And so there were those two threads. But the thing that surprised me the most was I had no idea that a book about a racehorse was going to lead me directly to the art movements of the post-World War II New York City abstract expressionism. And, so finally I get to use my fine arts degree. But it did. This story led right to Jackson Pollock and his death in his sports car. And who would have thought that that connection would be there? And again, Mark Twain was right. Truth needn't be. And it's funny with that book, because everything that seems most outrageously incredible in it are the true things. Over here.
Oh yes. I'm interested for your thoughts on recent reports that the readership of historical fiction has gone way down in recent years.
No idea. Not mine anyway, so there's
right.
that.
Okay, well that's good to know.
I think it depends. I mean, it's not such a strict genre as people, like to think. And you know, when you think of a novel like Charles Frazier's Cold Mountain, do you immediately say, oh, historical fiction? I don't know that you do. I don't think of it that way. I think of it as just fiction, right? So I don't know what exactly they're measuring when they say that it's gone down. I know that romance has gone way up. And so there's a whole genre of historical romance, which is also historical fiction. Anyway, luckily, I can still afford my kids' tuition.
Right here.
Maybe two, then you. Okay.
The question I have for you is your characters and moving them along in your book to bring them to life.
How do I do that?
Yes, choosing them and and bring them along in the book to life.
So I like to have a first-person narrator. That's the first thing that I look for. Who's going to tell this story, if it is possible? Now, I don't have enough hubris to say that I could think my way into a first-person account by Caleb Chase-Teermuck, the Native American graduate of Harvard. So I have to find somebody else who is more accessible to me to be the storyteller. And similarly with Jarrett, who actually existed, who was Lexington's groom, and was responsible for moving the horse all around the country and obviously had the closest relationship with the horse of anybody. But what his actual circumstances were and his life, there is scant record. So I had to take some liberties. So I try and research what can we find out about somebody else who was in a similar situation. And luckily there were two historical figures that I could use who, one was a jockey and one was a trainer who had had an experience of enslavement that was similar to his. And so I could take some material from their lives to try and weave a life for Jarrett. So that's one way. And then for contemporary characters, I just talk to as many people I can who will share their lived experience with me and pick from that the things that I will give, the feelings and the experiences that I will give my characters. Have we got time for just one more? Lady here? Yeah. I can repeat the question.
I love your books, and I wondered if you have some favorite historical fiction.
My favorite historical fiction, I think, probably the greatest book of historical fiction to me is Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. Absolutely magisterial. It's like she was Thomas Cromwell in a past life. She inhabits him so completely. American historical novel that I absolutely love it's got a really tough title to remember. It is I Should Be Extremely Happy in Your Company. And it's about Lewis and Clark. And it's absolutely brilliant by a writer called Brian Hall. And it deserves to be much more well-known than it is. And then the one that I think started me down the path, and I have a great soft spot for, is the English writer Mary Renault's book, The Persian Boy. Because she also writes with a first-person protagonist, narrator, and it's somebody who is a sideways witness to great events. So thank you all very much.